V'chiyamuch achicha u'matayata imach v'hechazatcha bo ger v'toshav v'chai imach al tikach meita nashech v'tarbit v'yareta me'elohecha v'chai achicha imach et kasbecha lo titen lo beneshech u'v'marbit lo titen ochlecha Ani Adonai Elohechem Asher etzeti etchem me'eretz Mitzrayim Latet lachem et eretz Canaan Liat lachem l'Elohim.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam Asher natan lanu Torah emet v'chayei olam natan b'tochenu Baruch atah Adonai noten haTorah.
Amen. Ya'amod David Naftali ben Yeshua Baruch im Sarah Chaya bat David Sachar Dov Shilishia. Baruch Hu Adonai Hamvorach. Baruch Adonai Hamvorach L'olam Va'ed. Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu Melech Haolam Asher Bachar Banu Mikol Ha'amim V'natan Lanu Et Torato. Baruch Atah Adonai Noten HaTorah.
Amen. V'chiyamuch achicha imach v'nimkar lach lo tavod bo avodat aved ki schir ketoshav yeh imach ad shnat hayovel yavod imach v'yatza meimach hu uvenav imo v'shav al mishpachto v'al chzat avotav yashuv ki avadaihem asher etzeti etem me'eretz Mitzrayim lo yimachru mimkarat aved lo tirdeva befarech ve'yareta me'elohecha.
Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu Melech Haolam Asher Natan Lanu Torah Emet V'chayei Olam Nata B'tochenu Baruch Atah Adonai Noten HaTorah. Fourth Aliyah. Ya'amod Chaim ben Shmuel v'Yehudit Revi'iyah.
Baruch Hu Adonai Hamvorach. Baruch Adonai Hamvorach L'olam Va'ed. Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu Melech Haolam Asher Bachar Banu Mikol Ha'amim V'natan Lanu Et Torato. Baruch Atah Adonai Noten HaTorah.
Amen. V'avdacha v'amatcha asher iyu lach ma'at hagoyim asher svivotechem mehem tiknu avod v'ama v'gam mibnei hatoshavim hagarim imachem mehem tiknu umimishpachtam asher imachem asher holidu bartechem v'ayu lachem la'achuzah v'hinachaltem otam livnechem acharechem la'reshet achuzah le'olam bahem tavodu u'lachechem b'nei Yisrael ish b'achiv l'tirdevo befarech.
Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu Melech Haolam Asher Natan Lanu Torah Emet V'chayei Olam Nata B'chotenu Baruch Atah Adonai Noten HaTorah.
Amen. Tamdu Aviva Kranja bat David Naftali v'Sarachaya im Tzipor Rivka bat David Naftali v'Sarachaya Chamishia.
Baruch Hu Adonai Havorach. Baruch Adonai Baruch Leolam Vaed. Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu Melech Haolam Asher Bachar Banu Mikol Hamim V'natan Lanu Et Torah. Baruch Atah Adonai Noten HaTorah. Amen. V'chi tasig yad ger v'tashav imach umach achicha imo v'nimkar lager tashav imach ola eker mishpacha ger acharei nimkar geula tielo achad me'achav igalenu ododo ben dodo Igalenu, Omisher Besaro, Mimishpachta, Igalenu, Oisiga Yada, Vanigo, Vachishav, Imkonehu, Mishnat, Himakrolo, Ad, Shnat, Hayavel, Vahaya, Kesef, Mimkara, Bamispar Shanim, Kimesachir, Iemo. Atah Adonai Eloheinu Melech Haolam Asher Natan Lanu Torah Emet V'chayei Olam Nata B'tocheinu Baruch Atah Adonai Noten HaTorah.
Amen. Yamod Yehoshua Baruch Ben Chaim Tzvi Shishia. Ben Tzvi Elimelech Shishi. I have what I have written down here.
It's okay. No. Baruch Hu et Adonai Hamavarach. Baruch Adonai Hamavarach L'olam Va'ed. Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu Melech Haolam Asher Bachar Banu Mikol Hamim V'natan Lanu et Torato. Baruch Atah Adonai Noten HaTorah.
Amen. Im Rabat Bashanim Lafihan Yashiv Gelato Mikasef Miknato Veimeyat Nishar Bashanim Ad Shnat Hayavel Vachishavlo Kefi Shanav Yashiv Ekelato Kischir Shana Bashana Iya Imo Lo Yordanu Baferach La'enecha Ve'im lo yiga'al ba'ele Ve'yatza bishnat hayavel Hu uvanav imo.
Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu Melech Haolam Asher Natan Lanu Torah Emet Chayei Olam Nata B'tocheinu Baruch Atah Adonai Noten HaTorah.
Amen. Yamod Rabbi Yisachar Dov Ben Aaron Moshe Shvi'iyah. Baruch Hu es Adonai Hamvorach. Baruch Adonai Hamvorach Li'olam Vo'ed. Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu Melech Haolam Asher Bachar Banu Mikol Hamim V'natan Lanu Et Torato. Baruch Atah Adonai Noten HaTorah.
Ki amen. Ki li ben Israel avadim avadaihem asher etzati atam me'eretz Mitzrayim. Ani Adonai lachem lo tasu lachem elilim ufesel umateva lo takimu lachem ve'even maskit lo titnu barzachem lishtachavot aleha ki ani Adonai Elohechem et shabtotai tishmoru umikdashi tirau ani Adonai.
Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu Melech Haolam Asher Natan Lanu Torah Emet V'chayei Olam Nata B'tocheinu. Baruch Atah Adonai Noten HaTorah.
Amen. Please rise for the Kaddish. Yitkadal v'yitkadash shmei Rabba.
Amen.
Be'alma divrach yiruteh v'yamlich malchuteh. B'chayechonu v'yomechon u'chayedecho beit Yisrael. Bagala uvizman kariv v'meru. Amen. Yehi shmei Rabba mevorach le'olam lo me'almaya. Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yiparichmam v'yitnaseh v'yithadar v'yitalev v'yithalal shmei dekudesh abrichu le'elam min kol birchata v'shirata tushbechata v'nechemata damiran be'alma v'meru. Amen.
Amen. You may be seated.
Tamod, 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 Abachura bat Mitzvah, Meira Esther bat David Naftali v'Sara Chaya Maftir, Chazok.
Baruch Hu Adonai Mevorach. Baruch Adonai Mevorach L'olam Va'ed. Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu Melech Haolam Asher Bachar Banu Mikol Ha'amim V'natan Lanu Et Torah. Baruch Atah Adonai Noten HaTorah. Ki li Bnei Yisrael Avadim Avadai Hem Asher Atati Atam Me'eretz Mitzrayim. Ani Adonai Lachem, Lo Tasu Lachem Elilim, Ufasel Umateva, Lo Takimu Lachem, Ve'even Maskit, Lo Titnu Bertachem, Lo Hishtachavot Aleha, Ki Ani Adonai Elohechem, Et Shabbatai Tishmoru, Umikdashi Tira'u, Ani Adonai. Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu Melech Haolam Asher natan lanu Torah emet v'chayei olam natan b'tzachinu. Baruch Atah Adonai Noten HaTorah.
Amen. Please rise for the lifting and tying of the Sefer Torah.
Bezot HaTorah Asher Moshe B'nei
You may be seated. The Haftarah for this morning can be found on page 539.
Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu Melech Haolam Asher Bachar B'Neviim Tovim V'Ratah B'Divrahem Hanemarim Be'emet. Baruch Atah Adonai Habocher B'Torah U'Moshe Avdo U'Yisrael Emo U'Nviei Hamet V'Tzedek. Vayomer Yirmeyahu Haya Davar Adonai Elai Limor Hina Chanamel Ben Shalom Dodcha Ba'elecha Lemor Kna Lecha Esadi Asher Banatot Ki Lecha Mishpat Gerla Liknot Vayava Elai Chanamel Ben Dodi Kidvar Adonai Al Chatzar Hamatara Vayomer Eli Knena Etzadi Asher Ba'anatot Asher Ba'eretz Binyamin Kilacha Mishpat Hayerusha Ulacha Hageulah Knena Lachach Va'ezah Ki Yizvar Adonai Hu Vekne Et Hasadeh Ma'at Chanamel Ben Dodi Asher Ba'anatot Veshkalala Et HaKesef Shiva Shekalim Vasera HaKasef V'achtov Ba'sefer V'achatom Va'ed Edim V'eshkol HaKesef V'maznaim V'ekach Et Sefer Hamikna Et HaChatum Hamitzvah V'hachukim V'et HaGalui V'yitan Et Sefer Hamikna Baruch Ben Neriah B'machzayah Leinei Chanamel Dodi Uleinei Haidim Hakotrim B'sefer Hamikna Leinei Kol Yehudim Hayashvim B'chatzar Hamatara V'azaveh Et Baruch Leineihem Leimor Komar Adonai Tzvaot Elhei Yisrael Lakach Et Hasvarim Ha'ele Et Sefer Hamikna Hazeh Ve'et HaChatum Ve'et Sefer HaGalui Hazeh Unatatam Bichlei Charas Laman Yamdu Yamim Rabim Ki Cha Amar Adonai Tzvaot Elhei Yisrael Od Yiknu Batim Vasadod Uchramim Ba'aretz Hazot Ve'palal Al Adonai Acharei Titi Et Sefer Hamikna Baruch Ben Neriah Leimor Aha Adonai Elohim Hina Ata Asita Et HaShamayim Ve'et Ha'aretz V'chachacha Hagadol V'yizracha Hanetuyah Lo yipaleh mimcha kol davar Oseh chesed lalafim Umeshalem avon avot Achek bneihem acharechem Ha'el Hagadol Hagibor Adonai Tzvaot Shemo Gadol Haita Verav Hallelujah Asher Einecha Pekuchot Al Kol Derechei Bnei Adam Latet Leish Kidrechav V'chipri Ma'al Alav Asher Samta Atat Umaftim Ba'eretz Mitzrayim Ad Hayom Hazeh U'Yisrael U'V'Adam V'Taselacha Hashem Kayom Hazeh V'Totzeh Edamkat Yisrael Ma'eretz Mitzrayim V'Atat B'Movtim V'Yad Chazaka V'Yizroa Natuyah V'Mora Gadol V'Titan Lahem Et Eretz Hazot Asher Nishbat Hala Avatam Latet Lahem Eretz Zavar Chalav Udvash Vayavohu V'Yershu Ota V'lo Shamu B'Kolecha V'Tortcha Lo Halachu Et Kol Asher Sivita Lahem Lasa Asu V'Takre Otam Et Kol Ra'a Hazot Hina Hasolot Ba'u Ha'ir Lachla Va'ir Nitna Beyad HaKastim HaNyochamim Aleha V'Pnei
v'cherev v'harav v'hadaver v'asher dibarta haya v'incha ro'eh v'ata amarta Elai Adonai Elohim Knei lach Hasadeh B'kesef V'ha'er Edim V'ir nitna B'yel kastim Vehi Jira Adonai Al Yirmeyahu Lemor Hina Ani Adonai Al Hay Kol Basar Hamimani Ipale Kodavar Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam Tzur kol olamim Tzadik b'chol adorot Ha'el ha'ne'eman Ha'omer ve'oseh Ha'medaber mekayem Shekol d'varav Emet v'tzedek Ne'eman Atahu Adonai Eloheinu V'ne'emanim d'varecha V'devar echad midvarecha Achor lo yashuv reikam Ki el melech ne'eman V'rachaman atah Baruch atah Adonai Ha'el ne'eman V'chol d'varav Rachem Al tion ki vit chayenu V'lalu vat nefesh toshia B'mhera b'yaminu Baruch atah Adonai Mesamech Zion B'avanaha Samcheinu Adonai Eloheinu B'Eliyahu Hanavi Avdacha U'v'malchut Beit David Meshichacha B'mhera yava V'yagal libenu Al Krisa lo yeshev zar V'lo yinkalu od acharim et kavoda Ki b'Hashem kodecha nishbata lo Shelo yichben ero l'olam v'ed Baruch atah Adonai Magen David Ala Torah, v'ala avodah, v'ala nevi'im, v'al yom ha-Shabbat hazeh, shenatata lanu, Adonai Eloheinu, likdusha u'limnucha, lechavod u'tifaret, ala kol, Adonai Eloheinu, anachnu modim lach, u'mavrachim otach, yibarach shimcha, befi kol chai tamid l'olam v'ed, Baruch atah Adonai, Mekadesh ha-Shabbat.
Amen. Semen tov, mazel tov, mazel tov, semen tov, mazel tov, semen tov, mazel tov, semen tov. Yehelanu, 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 oh lechol Yisrael. Yehelanu, yehelanu, oh lechol Yisrael. Yehelanu, yehelanu, oh lechol Yisrael. Yehelanu, yehelanu, oh lechol Yisrael.
Mazel tov, everyone. If you may be seated, it's my honor to call upon Ashley for a Dvar Torah.
Shabbat Shalom. In this week's Parsha, Bahar, the Torah designates every seventh year as the Shemitah. The Shemitah year acts as a Shabbat for the land, a year in which it can rest and recharge. We learn that if, for example, an apple grows on your tree during this year, you are not allowed to pick the apple. Instead, you must wait until it falls, at which point anyone can take it. This law serves as a reminder to be aware of others' needs and to give as much as you can to ensure that their needs are fulfilled. There is a midrash that states, one who does not till his field during the Shemitah year is a mighty warrior. Why would the midrash consider him a warrior? How does not tilling your field equate with fighting war? I think that the midrash regards someone who follows the laws of Shemitah as a warrior because this person does not succumb to social pressures. During the period of the time in which he does not till his land, many people probably tell him all the reasons why he should not observe the Shemitah year. Despite all of this, he does not give in. He knows that his land comes from the promise that God made to us, the Jewish people. In Bahar, we don't only learn about sustainable farming, we learn about what to find strength. God proceeds to tell Moses about the Jubilee year known as Yovel. Yovel occurs every 50th year after 7 cycles of 7 years. During Yovel, the Torah states that all land being worked must be returned to the original owner. Furthermore, all slaves must be freed and returned to their homes. The founding fathers of America were inspired by these directives. They used them to help forge America's values by inscribing a passage from Vayikra onto the Liberty Bell. It reads, "Proclaim liberty throughout all the land unto all the inhabitants." While preparing for my bat mitzvah, I had the honor of participating in Yad Vashem's twinning project. This project pairs a bar bat mitzvah with a murdered child of your age and birthday. By participating in this project, it is another way to ensure that they'll never be forgotten. I was paired with a boy named Israel Wieland. Israel was born on February 25, 1931, to Rivka and Samuel Wieland. He was killed in Auschwitz in 1944 at the age of 13. Israel lived in Amsterdam through the war. His Yad Vashem page of testimony was filled out by his sister Marguerite. Israel was one of the many victims of the Holocaust. We honor him today for the bar mitzvah he never had. In Israel's name, and in the name of my 4 great-grandparents who were Holocaust survivors, I will be donating a portion of my gifts to the Shoah Foundation. As a bat mitzvah, I will always be considerate of others, share, and make sure that all in the community are looked after. These are the lessons of my portion, and I will incorporate them into my life. Shabbat Shalom.
I began to think very much along the lines of what you spoke about, Ashley, an interesting connection, and that is the remarkable amount of metaphor and symbolism between things that grow in the ground and human beings. For example, we speak that humans will blossom, they will grow. We speak that that human beings will benefit, of course, from blossoming. We also speak about human life as withering and fading. We also think about humans sometimes, tragically, as being rotten. All the similar things that we find of things that grow in the ground. And so with that in mind, as Ashley spoke so beautifully, one of the big idea to come in the Torah portion for this morning is the idea of the Shemitah. It's the sabbatical year, which simply means, and this year in Israel, in fact, is a Shanat Shemitah, that for the 7th year on the calendar, that the agricultural land is not touched at all. It isn't watered, it's not harvested, it is not fielded or seeded in any way. And as you can well imagine, the reason why, or the rationale behind giving this is a simple but a deep one. And that is, on some level, it was hoped that on the 7th year, as a famous rabbi who lived about 700 years ago in the city of Prague, he said, the hope is that on the 7th year, that instead of the seeds being tilled into the ground, that God will come into the ground, and God will blossom and grow, and God will spread all over the world. While the Torah talks about that happening in the 7th year, human life isn't quite like that. For human life to blossom and grow, we know that it has to be seeded all the time with the right things. And so Ashley, on this morning of your bat mitzvah, I know I joined with Cantor Moses, myself, your family, in recognizing all the things that you have done to seed this bat mitzvah with the kinds of things that will blossom and bloom and grow and bring the things that make the Jewish people something that should be admired and strong and needed in this world. Your presence here in this morning, Ashley, in other words, is not just to celebrate your bat mitzvah, but it is a recognition not just of all the Shabbatot that you've been here before, but the many more you'll be here in the future. And so it is my honor to present to you this certificate of bat mitzvah, along with a few other gifts from the congregation to remind you of all the things you did to arrive to this moment and all the things that you'll do beyond this moment. I'm going to ask Ashley's mom and dad to kindly stand. Ashley, you as well, sweetie. And they're going to recite the bat mitzvah blessing along with me. Baruch, Sheptarani, Me'ansho, Shalzo, Shehechianu, Vikiyamanu, Vihigianu, Lazman Hazeh. Give a hug and a kiss. Mazel tov, mazel tov, mazel tov. I'd like to ask everyone to kindly rise as we'll now recite prayers on behalf of the state of Israel and the prayer for Canada. For the honor of these prayers, I would like to call upon Dahlia Lerner and Miriam Vale. Which one is Dahlia? Okay, so you're first. Right here. Nice to meet you. Pleasure to meet you. No, so we're going to do Canada first. Yeah.
Okay.
Just the whole text. All the way to the bottom.
Okay. Our God and God of our ancestors, we ask your blessings upon our country and upon the leaders of our nation and of our communities. Inspire all who lead and serve to conduct their affairs honorably. May peace and security, happiness and prosperity, right and freedom abide among us forever. Unite the inhabitants of our country of all backgrounds and creeds so that we may banish hatred and bigotry. Safeguard our noblest ideals and preserve those institutions which nurture liberty. May this land under your providence be an influence for good throughout the world, helping to advance peace and freedom among all peoples and bring closer to fulfillment the visions of your prophets. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, and neither shall they learn war anymore. For the work of righteousness shall be peace, and the effect of righteousness calm and confidence forever.
Our Father in heaven, rock and redeemer of the people of Israel, bless the state of Israel with its promise of redemption. Shield it with your love, spread over it the shelter of your peace. Guide its leaders and advisors with your light and your truth. Help them with your good counsel. Strengthen the hands of those men and women who bravely defend our holy land. Deliver them. Crown their efforts with triumph. Bless the land with peace and its inhabitants with lasting joy. And let us say, Amen.
Everyone, please remain standing. Bottom page 254.
Yeah, hallelujah, et Shem Adonai, ki nizkar v'shemo levado, hodo alem shamayim, hayarem kerem yamo,
Page 360.
ובנוחה יאמר. עת חיים היא למחזיקים בה ותומכיה מיושר דרכיה דרכי נועם וכל נתיבותיה שלום השיבנו אדוני אליך ונשובה חדש ימינו 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 חדש ימינו כקדם.
You may be seated. Shabbat Shalom and Mazel Tov, everyone. A week ago at this moment, I was in a very different place. I was in Berlin teaching at the Conservative Rabbinic Seminary there. And straddling over the Shabbat that I was there, I was invited to speak on Shabbat morning at the Oranienburger Strasse Synagogue. It was built in 1886, in the heart of Berlin's Jewish area, an ascendant, hopeful, prosperous Jewish community. And the synagogue soars into the sky with these beautiful, remarkable golden domes that you can spot almost from anywhere in the city. In 1920, Albert Einstein even played a violin concert there. But 73 years after being built, it entered into history in an unusual way. As Kristallnacht engulfed Jews throughout Germany, as their homes and schools and businesses and synagogues were targeted for destruction, on that evening, the Oranienburger Strasse Shul was set on fire as well. And the reports tell us that people left their homes to watch the spectacle of it going up in flames, but not the Jews. They dared not open their doors on that evening. And just as it seemed that it would join the fate of so many other Jewish places on that evening, suddenly, a district police officer, a man named Otto Belgart, arrived and drew his pistol, ordering the arsonists away and the firefighters to come and douse the flames. And to this date, there's debate over why he did that and why did he place himself in great danger to save just a building. Not a small amount of ink has been spilled in people trying to figure out the why of his actions. Because despite Belgart's actions on that evening, during the war, the building was seriously damaged by Allied bombing. And only decades later was it to be rebuilt and rededicated. So standing there on that morning a week ago, it left me very emotional. Generally, because being Jewish and being in Germany is always an emotional and complicated thing, but particularly because 1.5 kilometers from where I stood on that Shabbat morning, my father's cousins were dragged out of their homes on 10 Frankfurt Grosse On that day in October the 18th, 1941, Irene Flansreich and her 1-year-old daughter Marion were loaded onto Berlin Transport F and sent to Lodz, where they were murdered in Chelmno. 5 kilometers where I stood in that morning, other cousins, Selma and Moses Flansreich and their son Gunther, were dragged out of their home at number 57 Motstrasse and were sent to Lodz on the same transport, where they eventually were murdered. Which is to say that being there was both easy and hard. Hard because of history and loss, and easy because I believe that our emphatic, unapologetic presence there is the only and the best answer to what was done. But to this day, even 80 years later, the questions will not go away. Why should Jews be there in the first place? People often thought, I can't believe, they said, that there are Jews who actually live in Germany. Why have anything, others would say, to do with them and that being Germany and Germans? Now, growing up in New York as I did, we were probably the only Jewish family that had an Italian doctor. Now, all of our Italian neighbors all bragged about the Jewish lawyers and accountants and doctors, but ours was Italian. On the surface, it seemed funny, but to know him was to understand why. Dr. Thomas Spinelli was a bright, caring, warm, and gentle man who once asked me, how is it that Jews can drive German cars? He confided to me that he would never buy one. The northern Italian village where his family came from had been brutally destroyed by the Wehrmacht in the Second World War. This kind of question drew a little closer to me when I got my first razor. It was just after my bar mitzvah, and someone gifted me with an electric one because religious Jews do not use straight-edge blades on their face. It's an ancient Jewish law. The electric razor that I was gifted was by Krupp's, a German company. Not just a German company, but Krupp's was part of the German industrial military war machine. My father took one look at it and said, we're going to get you a Remington. Now, I didn't know the difference between a Krupp and a Remington, but not being allowed to use the Krupp made me want it even more. But make no mistake, this is a debate that has many legs to it. In 1956, the State of Israel concluded an agreement on war reparations with Germany. In essence, the German government was going to pay the Jewish state for the destruction of Jewish life, Jewish enslavement, and Jewish property. It also ignited a firestorm in Israel. But the Jewish state had gone from a population of 680,000 in 1948 to 1.8 million in 1956. That's nearly triple the population in 8 years. And the sheer weight and cost of absorbing all of those immigrants while maintaining the defense necessary for that besieged small state left it precarious and weak and broke. Still, the question of whether to take or not take the money cut a deep, deep line in the young country. A young Menachem Begin called it blood money and treason against the dead. Then Prime Minister Ben-Gurion said that they had no choice. They needed the money and they needed it urgently. So they took it. But the questions haven't gone away. Like, why take the money even if you need it? And like, why would I go to Berlin? Because if it is true, and I believe it is, that whenever Jews go to Europe, they see ghosts, then to go to Berlin is closer to walking with them. After all, it is ground zero of our greatest nightmare. How do you listen to German being spoken in the streets? Walk the very streets where the Nazi parades were held and not say to yourself, I'm in the wrong place. In some ways, the opening words of the Torah reading tells us something very complex in a simple way. You see it because it begins by declaring, Vayidaber Hashem Moshe Bahar Sinai, and God spoke to Moses on Sinai saying, and this left generations of rabbis bewildered. And that's because they were bewildered, That's because we are reading the book which comes after the Israelites were standing at Sinai after leaving Egypt, meaning that the revelation at Sinai happens years earlier. And yet we read this morning of God speaking to Moses at Sinai. This is the third book of the Torah. And it is in the second book that we read about God speaking at Sinai. And the Meda, the big question which hovers all of this, is either you're there or you're not there. Either you're standing at Mount Sinai hearing God, or you're somewhere else, because you cannot be in two places at the same time. And the answer that I have always been drawn to is the one by one of our greatest biblical commentators, Rashi, who lived in Worms about 1,000 years ago. That the entire Torah was given at Sinai, he says. But the words given there did not end there. Like the echo in the desert, the message of Sinai is carried over time to every generation. In saying the words of our foundational covenant carries from Sinai to every generation, is saying what binds every Jew is that we have a collective history. It says that we are made from that which comes from this law and this language and our memories and our love and our concerns. To be a Jew is to consider yourself to be part of that collective story. But while we are a people, but we are also people. Because while we share a collective history and a collective destiny, we do not share collective responsibility, which is to say that every person stands on their own merit of their record on this world. A bad deed by one Jew cannot color every Jew, just as the good deed of one person is not yours either. So this past Wednesday, I was welcomed into Berlin's only Jewish high school, the Mendelssohn School, named after the German Jewish philosopher Moses Mendelssohn. It has a near unbroken 250-year history of educating Jewish children. And as I darted between the lines of kippah-wearing children running in and out of their classrooms, noticed that there were pictures of nearly 30 German Jews who won the Nobel Prize. Many of them you can list with ease, by the way. Planck, Einstein, Ehrlich, Warburg, Sachs. But we can also do the same with anti-Semites, right? The list is long and dispiriting, and they come easy to the tongue. Roald Dahl, Degas, Rudyard Kipling, Chesterton, Theodore Dreiser, Voltaire, Justinian, Chekhov, St. Ambrose, Robert Lowell, André Gide, Chaucer, Toynbee, Juvenal. The list goes on and on. I told some of the children that morning that those pictures of the German Jews who were Nobel Prize laureates are only inspiration to make something of their lives, to remember that the world is not what was, but only built on what was. The story of Jews in Berlin begins with 50 wealthy Austrian German Jewish families who were invited by the German King Frederick in the early 1700s with the hope that they would bring their wealth, business, and connections to a struggling city. But it was all on the condition of collective responsibility. Frederick told them that if one Jew was found guilty of wrongdoing, that each and every one of them would be held accountable as if they had done it themselves. Stereotypes are for lazy imaginations. But Hitler had many, many willing accomplices. And the Germany today is filled with that difficult recognition. But are the people who live there today, many of them grandchildren and great-grandchildren of those perpetrators, are they to be held guilty for the sins of those who came before them? They have a collective history, but no one should ever bear the burden of collective responsibility. Otherwise, we are all condemned to a past, and none of us will have a future. But back to our first question. The shul I spoke in last week, how it was spared on Kristallnacht in 1938. People have wondered why Otto Belkart risked his life and the safety of his family to spare the synagogue. At first, some speculated that maybe he was concerned for the non-Jewish homes in the area, that it might get caught up in the flames, destroy their homes too. Or maybe some thought it was because he wanted to preserve the files of Jewish families who were members of the synagogue for the eventual Nazi deportations. But later on it was discovered that Bogart was a member of the Nazi Party, but he loathed the Nazis. He had close, warm relationships with his Jewish neighbors and joined the party only to keep his job as a policeman, but did whatever he could, whenever he could, to get in the way of their wretched plans. In 1996, when that synagogue was rebuilt and rededicated, his family was invited to attend. But the ancient rabbi said it in a much better way. A human king, they said, stamps coins, making each one alike. But the King of Kings creates every human being, and none are the same. Shabbat Shalom.
I don't know if we have the mic. I don't know if it really works. Okay.
ושמרו בני ישראל את השבת, לעשות את השבת לדורות הברית עולם. בני ישראל אותי לעולם, אותי לעולם, אותי לעולם. ושמרו בני ישראל את השבת, לעשות את השבת לדורות הברית עולם. כי 6 ימים עשה אדוני את השמיים ואת הארץ, ושמרו בני ישראל את השבת, לעשות את השבת לדורותם ברית עולם. וביום השביעי שבת ויהי נפש, שבת ויהי נפש, שבת ויהי נפש. ושמרו בני ישראל ואת השבת, לעשות את השבת לדורותם ברית עולם.
Alekein berach Adonai yom ha-Shabbat v'kadshehu, Davri baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, Odei peri hagafen.
You may be seated, page 436.
Grape juice?